It's one of the highest profile criminal cases in modern history, and yet a thick veil of secrecy surrounds the trial of Dzhokhar Tsarnaev. In the absence of cameras in the courtroom, the public is forced to rely on reporter accounts and sketches to get a sense of the proceedings. Jury selection is perhaps the most covert part of the process. I attended the first day of voir dire, and the media was kept behind a glass partition and asked to leave the room while prospective jurors completed a questionnaire. One of those would-be jurors was Ted Wayman, a former local news anchor who has since been dismissed from the jury pool. I sat down with him earlier today to learn more about his experience, and I began by asking when he realized he was being vetted for the marathon bombing trial.
When I got my jury summons, I knew that the marathon bombing start date for jury was then, but I've covered a lot of trials in federal court, and there's a lot of trials going on at the same time. And I was like, well, maybe it could. When I arrived, I saw the media throng, media circus, and I realized they were all there for that case. Now, would I get that case? That was the question.
What was the mood like as you were waiting to get instructions from the judge? I mean, were you talking with other prospective jurors? Were people talking about the case, about whether the Tsarnaev could get a fair trial here in Boston? Was that discussed?
It wasn't even discussed. It was actually, we were instructed really not to speak. You could read, you could just kind of observe, and then all of a sudden, prosecution team came into the room. Now, granted, I'm sitting with 200 other prospective jurors. Prosecution team comes in, defense team comes in with the defendant, and then Judge O'Toole comes in, and we realized everybody looked at and saw the defendant and was like, this is the case.
What did you make of his demeanor when he came in? Were you watching him closely? Or?
Everybody, all eyes, once he went on, almost gasped within the courtroom like, oh my gosh, that's the defendant. Unresponsive, really uninterested in the whole process, had very little contact with his defense team. He was sitting in the middle of them, really didn't look at the jury pool, didn't look at the media was there, didn't look at the judge when he addressed the defendant. He was uninterested in the whole process.
Did you think there was any chance that you were going to end up being, making it through the process, given that you're a journalist? I mean, did you think you might end up having to serve?
I realized quickly that once I saw the survey, I knew members of the prosecution team. I knew Judge O'Toole had been in his courtroom before on separate cases, and I knew of some of the defense team. I realized once I made those disclosures, neither side would want me on.
Tell me more about what the questionnaire had on it. We've heard media reports of some of what was on there, but what else was on the questionnaire?
Very detailed, very insightful, very respectful. Asking first of all, do you have any connection to anybody in the marathon bombing? Do you have any connection to law enforcement? Do you have any connection to prosecution? Do you have any connection to defense team? A lot of different questions, religious questions, where you grew up, how many kids in your family, what your parents do. They went very deep. At least it took me 60 minutes to fill out the survey.
When you say religious questions, what kind of stuff did they ask on that front?
How much I knew about Islam. What were my thoughts about it? They really wanted to kind of see, did I have any bias either way? And people would make those own judgments through that survey.
Any questions about terrorism more broadly or U.S. foreign policy, that kind of thing?
Not so much policy, but terrorism, even going back as far as 9/11.
Did you talk with any of your fellow prospective jurors after filling out the questionnaire?
No. We were instructed not to speak to jurors, not to speak to anyone once we passed in our survey.
Did people adhere to those instructions, or did you hear anyone maybe violating what they've been asked to do?
I certainly kept it until I was dismissed, and then I could talk about it. And I think people were very respectful of the process, that the judge instructed us not to speak about it until either we were dismissed from the jury, and even if we were kept on the jury, we were not supposed to speak of it. And out of those 1,200 people, there would only be 12 jurors and 6 alternates. So only 18 people out of that, a lot of people were going to get dismissed, like myself.
As you know, the defense tried to delay the trial in the wake of the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo offices. What's your take, as someone who was part of the jury pool, on whether those attacks will be problematic for whoever ends up being called? Do you think that'll be a problem?
I don't think so. I think it's far removed. It's obviously, it's a 24-hour news cycle. Things happen quickly. There'll be another headline tomorrow. But I think what it comes down to is Judge O'Toole. I've been in his courtroom many times. He's a very strict jurist. What he says goes. He wants this trial to move forward, and obviously it is.
Do you think that Dzhokhar Tsarnaev can get a fair trial in Boston?
I've been asked that many times. I believe he can. I believe people are there as part of their civic duty to be on a jury. They take it responsibly, very seriously, and I think that they'll come up with the right verdict.
So what about this defense argument that all of us, or if not all of us, a vast majority of people who live in the Boston area are in some way victims of the marathon attacks? If you weren't harmed, if you don't know someone who was harmed, you were affected by the lockdown. You saw these traumatic images replayed on TV again and again and again in the subsequent days. What do you think of that argument?
Well, it's coming up almost 2 years ago. Clearly, it's still very vivid in our memories. Either we know somebody or know somebody connected to it. I think that he can still get a fair trial there. But you could move this anywhere in the 50 states, and it would still be a difficult case. And I believe that Judge O'Toole wants to have this trial, a speedy trial, as speedy as he can, and to have it in this district. And I think that he'll get about as fair a trial as he'll get anywhere.
I also asked Ted about the potential witnesses listed on the questionnaire, and he told me none of the names came as a surprise. They were mostly law enforcement and first responders, many of whom he recognized from his years covering stories here.